Good day, my name is Gordon O'Brien, and today I'm going to be presenting the fifth of a series of 5 blended learning modules. This blended learning module is titled Management of Environmental Flows and Water Resources on Multiple Spatial Scales from Targets to Sustainable Development Goals. This is somewhat of a presentation to demonstrate how you would implement some of the outcomes of these water resource management procedures. This blended learning module has been produced as an outcome of the Nile Basin Initiative study titled Coarse Environmental Flow Assessment for Selected Sites in the Nile Basin. Just to look at some context again, that this has been presented in the context of the strategy for the management of environmental flows in the Nile Basin. The Nile Eflows course assessment blended learning modules have been developed in 2016 and 2017, and that has also contributed to the development of these blended learning modules. The blended learning modules address principles of good environmental flows, aspect of environmental flow assessment methods, transboundary management principles and practices, and the application of the regional environmental flow assessments and the implementation of the Nile Eflows framework. And all of that contributes to finally the management of environmental flows in the context of sustainable development goals, which is what is going to be the subject of this presentation. Again, this is the fifth of 5 blended learning modules. The first is an introductory module. The second was a presentation on the environmental flow framework and its application. Then we presented environmental flow assessment methods, looking at some advantages and disadvantages. Then we presented PropFlow and its application in the African context with some case studies, which is what has also been used in the Nile Basin. And now we're going to look at the implementation of the framework and environmental flows in the context of sustainable development goals. This is the structure of the presentations. There's going to be an introduction and objectives of the module, content of the module, lessons, as well as further reading recommendations. And just to contribute to that structure, to demonstrate where we are in the presentation, we've provided the small key that will be available throughout the presentation on the right-hand side of the screen. Again, this is the fifth of 5 blended learning modules. The content of this module includes, we're going to look at water resource use and protection related to sustainable development goals. We're going to look at national targets and objectives that have been or can be determined, established to meet sustainable development goals on multiple spatial scales. And that is what the main objective of this presentation is, to look at if we are going to achieve sustainable development on a regional basin scale, what is it that we need to be doing on the ground, and how do we upscale those local scale objectives or targets to ensure that overall we will be meeting our national targets, which are correlated with sustainable development goals. What we're going to look at in particular is the resource-directed measures that has been established through the National Water Act in South Africa, and the resource-directed measures have gained international recognition, I would say, and have been amended and or adopted by many countries in Africa and also around the world. And following a recent publication on how the approach can be used to determine targets and objectives for sustainable development goals, there are many examples of the approach being implemented in other countries, developed countries around the world as well. So we're going to look at resource-directed measures, and in particular the classification of resources and the determination of resource quality objectives that finally result in gazetted objectives or targets, and how those targets then contribute to meeting sustainable development goals. Finally, we're going to look at targets and objectives for water resources in the context of the Nile Eflows framework. To start, let's look at sustainable development goals. So in 2015, the United Nations General Assembly and heads of states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The outcome of that process included 17 sustainable development goals that have proposed to be achieved by 2030 for the sustainability of the globe. The agenda has 17 sustainable development goals that are underpinned by 169 targets that describe, and these targets are described by 230 indicators with associated methods. So there are methods, 230 indicators that will contribute towards explaining 169 targets, and in combination they will all contribute to achieving 17 Sustainable Development Goals that the United Nations has established to be achieved by 2030. However, this system is largely aspirational, and most of the targets do not have numerical values for the globe. So in 2030, for the Agenda 2030, which was established in 2015 by the United Nations, also states that it is the responsibility of each nation to contextualize the goals and targets for their own purpose, and that it is the implementation at a country level that would be key to success of the Sustainable Development Goals. So in effect, each nation has the responsibility to establish their own targets to achieve these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This is a picture of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is becoming very popular. And you can see, although there are many different Sustainable Development Goals established for a range of socio-ecological, economic, and ecosystem well-being, we are particularly interested in Sustainable Development Goal number 6, which refers to clean water and sanitation. So the definition of sustainable development in the context of these SDGs is that promoting sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth, creating greater opportunities for all, reducing inequalities, raising basic standards of living, fostering equitable social development and inclusion, and promoting integrated and sustainable management of natural resources and ecosystems that support inter alia the economy or economic, social, and human development while facilitating ecosystem conservation, regeneration and restoration, and resilience in the face of new and emerging challenges. This, in effect, is the future that we want to achieve, and this is the aspiration that we have for all people and the environment, the world that we live in, to achieve the sustainable balance so that it can continue to provide the resources that we need and maintain those features that it has into the future. What we're interested in is the determination of a procedure for the setting of targets and benchmarks on multiple spatial scales. As I said, we need to be able to establish targets and objectives on a regional or a reach scale that can then be synchronized and upscaled to address the overall sustainable or the overall protection and use balance that is needed to achieve that sustainability on a basin scale. So we know what we need on a basin scale or even on a national scale according to the Sustainable Development Goals. The question we have is, what do you need to do on the ground, and how do you do that on the ground, and how do you coordinate what you're doing on the ground so that you can achieve those overall regional scale, basin scale Sustainable Development Goals or targets. The paper that the outcomes of the method that I'm going to be presenting to you today has been published in a paper titled Defining and Quantifying National Level or Targets, Indicators and Benchmarks for the Management of Natural Resources to Achieve Sustainable Development Goals. And that was published in 2018 by Dr. Chris Dickens et al. From the paper, in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, targets are referred to as aspirational and global, with each government setting its own targets, guided by the global level of ambition, but also taking into account national circumstances. So that is where the crux of what it is that each nation will do and has to do to achieve sustainability. That is something that has to be established on a national level. The United Nations recognizes that there are different approaches, visions, models, and tools available in each country in accordance with its national circumstances and priorities. And that is something that needs to be embraced when establishing these targets and or these objectives to allow us to implement some of these water resource management approaches, such as environmental flows. The hierarchy of terms aligned with the 2030 agenda includes the importance of establishing a vision for the resource, and that includes determining what level of use and or protection, ensuring that it is still sustainable, is established by each country. In many situations, depending on the level of development or the the planned level of development of each nation. Some areas within nations are allocated for high use areas, although that will not exceed sustainability thresholds, and other areas are allocated for high protection for tourism and other activities. So if you combine that, we want to ensure that sustainability is maintained throughout each area, but there are some aspirational requirements of certain nations and or regions of the world that would prefer improved or better protection values or features or levels compared to other areas. And that's something that the stakeholders of those resources themselves and the people who are affected by those decisions need to make. So they make the decisions themselves. Second is looking at setting goals, including sustainable development goals, so that you can understand what it is that you are aiming to achieve in the context of those sustainable development goals. Setting targets, indicators, and indicator methods in order to achieve those targets, report on the targets, for example, and then importantly, the benchmarks, including the numerical values that will achieve those targets. And if those are available on multiple spatial scales, you should then be able to implement that and by achieving those benchmarks, those numerical values, you will then achieve the desired state of those indicators, and those tools that you use will demonstrate that those targets can be achieved, the goals can be achieved, and the final vision can be achieved. That is the concept of the approach that has been presented in this publication. As I said earlier, we're going to give you the examples from resource-directed measures and water resource management from South Africa, and this approach is available in the 2013 National Water Resource Strategy that was published by the Department of Water Affairs, which is now referred to as the Department of Water and Sanitation in South Africa. And just to highlight the vision of this National Water Resource Strategy, and you can see the overlap with Sustainable Development Goals, is that in South Africa, water resources must be managed in a sustainable, equitable, and secure way so that water is available for a better life and environment for all. And what really is important there is the concepts of sustainability, equitability, and just to ensure that we have these environmental features and the services provided by the environment in the future for all South Africans. In South Africa, the demonstration of how water resource management is implemented has been summarized in this poster, and this is a useful poster to demonstrate how the National Water Act was established with the requirements to protect, use, develop, conserve, manage, and control water resources in the context of sustainability, equitability, and efficiency. And the custodians who have been established to implement this as of 2013, when this was published, was the Department of Water Affairs and Forestry, now referred to as the Department of Water and Sanitation, and they would then implement the National Water Resource Strategy. This strategy then would also be implemented through catchment management agencies, and they would have a catchment management strategy, and this is the presentation of the catchment management strategy that was established for these different catchment management agencies. It includes the reserve, which considers the ecological reserve, the ecological requirements, as well as basic human needs. And this is what is referred to as environmental flows. So in South Africa, the ecological reserve refers to the volume, timing, duration, frequency of flows required to maintain the ecosystem and maintain the basic requirements of South Africans. And that is synonymous with the environmental flows. In addition to that, South Africa would also establish allocable amounts to be able to allocate resource use in an equitable, sustainable manner, consider strategic use of water resources and future planning, intercatchment transfers, and the importance of trying to balance water availability across the country where the development and population growth is unequally distributed across the country, and importantly, establishing these international obligations to ensure that South Africa's neighbours receive a equitable share of water resources in South Africa. And the Lesotho Highlands South Africa relationship is a very good example of that. If you look at other considerations within the strategy, we consider formal uses of water to include the ecosystem itself, which must be allocated water, and that is the ecological requirements through the ecological reserve. We consider recreation and the well-being of human beings and other ecosystem services, goods and services associated with water that must be provided. We consider, and then if you look at different allocations and the management of those allocations in terms of discharging wastewater, we have a process called source-directed controls, which governs that process, and then we consider how those water resources are allocated. And all of this whole picture and all of these procedures that underpin this process is sustainability. And very similarly, on a global scale, the Sustainable Development Goals have been established to ensure that this be undertaken in a sustainable manner. In South Africa, the resource quality objective approach was initially designed to achieve something very similar, and we've demonstrated how that approach can be utilized and implemented to set up these resource quality objectives or targets on multiple spatial scales to achieve that sustainable balance. And that really is what we're presenting in this presentation. This is a schematic diagram of the resource-directed measures of the Department of Water Affairs in South Africa. And interestingly, or simply, it has these different procedural steps. The first is establishing a vision for the resource. And as I said earlier, this is where we want to, stakeholders get to decide whether or not it would have a high protection or a high use focus. And in order to establish this vision, you need to understand what the user requirements are, as well as what the ecological requirements are. And if the environmental flow determination process has been undertaken to establish the ecological reserve, then we can determine what the ecological environmental requirements are in a sustainability context. What does the environment need to ensure that its biodiversity as well as key ecosystem processes are maintained? And in South Africa, that process is called the ecological reserve, which is environmental flows. If you knew what the environmental flows were, the ecological requirements were, what the user requirements were, you would then be able to establish a vision for the resource. And that is achieved through this process of classification of resources. And I'm going to expand on that in a moment. The classification results in the selection of management classes for each integrated unit of analysis. And each integrated unit of analysis is that spatial area where you have a consistent use and or protection focus. An example will be if you have a conservation area, you can assume that all the goal or the vision for water resources in a conservation area would be to protect the water resource and its associated biodiversity and processes. In the urban center, downstream or upstream of that conservation area, you would demarcate that as a separate integrated unit of analysis, this regional area, where you would then for that area choose to use water resources, and that use, depending on the strategic location, on the economy, on the size of the population, it could become a heavily used water resource use area, and that IUA would have a completely different vision compared to the conservation area. So that's why we refer to the importance of choosing these demarcating these integrated units of analyses, and then setting a vision for each of these. The resource quality objectives then become the targets, and those objectives that are established on reach scale, regional scale, and even on a basin scale to achieve the management class for each of those integrated units of analyses, those spatial areas. RQOs can be established in the context of water quantity or flows that are generally outputs from environmental flow determination procedures, where the requirements of environmental flows are allocated to particular areas to ensure that the minimum volumes, the timing, the duration, the frequency of flows are met to achieve those objectives and ensure that that vision is achieved. But as well as quantity, habitat, and biota objectives can also be used as indicators to establish resource quality objectives in South Africa. Once they have been determined, they are gazetted, they become legal requirements for different areas, and then we go through a process of implementing those objectives and monitoring. And they're implemented through source-directed controls, and there's two different aspects of source-directed controls in South Africa. The first is the implementation of ecological requirements, which is generally the responsibility of regulators, and then the implementation of user requirements through source-directed controls, and that's through the process of issuing licenses and ensuring that users achieve the restrictions imposed on them on the license, and they also have certain monitoring requirements. So in combination between formal stakeholders, conservationists, regulators, managers of generally of government and of different areas, and license requirements for different users, and ensuring that they're meeting their license requirements and monitoring the requirements of their licenses, we would then be able to implement and monitor these resource quality objectives, which would then be implemented to achieve the management class of a particular area, which would then inform and allow us to achieve the classification of water resources and the associated vision, which ultimately will give us the balance between the use of resources and the protection of resources to achieve sustainability. And that is how it can be simplified. In the context of the RDM approach for South Africa, I'm going to just start with the management classes, and the classes are those attributes that the Department of Water Affairs as the custodian and society require for different water resources, as I explained. The process requires a wide range of trade-offs to be evaluated at a number of scales, and these trade-offs are usually considered in a scenario basis where we have different protection scenarios or different use scenarios, for example, that are considered, and usually that allows these multiple stakeholders to choose a particular type of balance between use and protection of resources based on a scenario. Many environmental flow determination studies, as we've presented in previous blended learning modules, actually incorporate some of these scenarios where different trade-offs between the protection and the use of water resources can be considered. The final outcome of the process is a set of desired characteristics for the use and ecological conditional protection of each water resource. Then moving on to the management classes that are established to achieve that vision. We have 3 classes in South Africa, very simply just 3. In other countries in Africa, they use a slightly different approach. They use A, B, or C, for example, high protection, moderate protection, low protection, or low use, moderate use, high use, for example. And they're all very similar. So we refer to class 1 as a minimally used classification for a particular integrated IUA. That's those spatial areas that have a consistent use and or protection focus, where the overall condition of the water resource is minimally altered from its pre-development condition. And that we generally refer to must have a B ecological category. We in South Africa and in other parts of the continent use an A to F classification system, where A refers to a natural unmodified ecosystem, B is largely natural, C is moderately modified, D is largely modified but still sustainable. So D represents the threshold of sustainability. E and F would then refer to largely modified and critically modified ecological conditions, which would represent those resources that are in an unsustainable, threatened, and or severely impaired ecological state. So for class 1, we're referring to the management target would be to establish an ecosystem in a B category, which would refer to a very high protection level where most of the parts of that regional area would be in a B ecological category, which would be largely natural, or higher, referring to an A category. Class 2 is moderately used, where the overall condition of the water resource is moderately altered from its pre-development condition, mostly C ecological categories or moderately modified ecological categories, where all the features of those resources are intact, but there is a moderate use of those resources. And additional information on what that means exactly is available in the National Water Resource Strategy if anybody is interested. That is also included in the literature and the recommendation for additional literature in the blended learning module at the end of the module. And finally, category 3 refers to heavily utilized resource, where the overall condition of the water resource is significantly altered from its pre-development condition, where most of the water resources in that integrated unit of analysis, that spatial area with a consistent use or protection focus would be in a D, or largely modified ecological category. And here you will notice that this approach does not allow for any classification to be proposed, any vision associated with a resource to be established in an unsustainable state. So you may not choose an E or an F ecological category as a management class for a resource, because it suggests that that resource would not be in a sustainable state. And according to this classification system, you can allocate either a high protection or high use focus, but it must all be sustainable. So it must be in a D ecological category or better. Here is an example. This is an example of one of the first case studies that implemented this procedure in the Olifants River catchment in South Africa, which is a part of the larger Limpopo River catchment. And in this case study, 12 IUAs, or spatial areas, were demarcated for that whole catchment using various boundaries, catchment boundaries, land use boundaries, for example. And you can see that of the 12 resource unit, or the integrated units of analysis for the whole basin, there was a range of class 1, and the Blyde River catchment was the only area where a high protection focus was selected for that catchment, because it includes the Blyde River Canyon and an important conservation area in the catchment. But then you would see that there are class 2 and 3 classes established for the rest of the basin. What's important to consider here is that in order to achieve overall biodiversity and sustainability targets, in some cases, a class 3 throughout the whole basin will not achieve the biodiversity and protection features you need throughout the basin. And an example here is where the upper Olifants River catchment is heavily utilized by urbanization, mining, agricultural activities, for example, and it's of strategic importance to the country for power generation, for example. But if you allocated a class 3 for this IUA and class 3 downstream, it does allow for an acceptable allocation or deterioration of the ecosystem from its natural state, but still ensuring that it's sustainable. But there will definitely be populations of species and certain processes that cannot be maintained in that particular area that is representative of the upper part of the basin. And that required the determination of this resource, this integrated unit of analysis area here, which includes the Bronkhorstspruit and the Volga River, to be allocated with a classification 2. So the protection requirements in this IUA, which is adjacent to the IUA 1, which is in the upper part of the Olifants River catchment, was allocated a class 2. And the idea here is that this would act as somewhat of a refuge area for many species and or processes that could then be could allow the upper part of the Olifants River to recover from this high use allocation in the future. So if you allocated a high use in this part of the catchment, there would be certain species and or processes that may have been lost in the whole catchment. And in order to avoid that, a higher protection requirement was allocated for the Volga River integrated unit of analysis, this regional area here, and to offset this class 3. And that has similarly been the procedure that was considered across the whole catchment. So if you look at one catchment area where it is all connected by the Olifants River itself, you can see that there has been a balance between class 1, class 2, and class 3s allocated for this basin. Interestingly as well, you can see that there is a relatively high resource use focus that has been allocated to this basin because of the high demand for resources and the strategic location of this basin and the importance of power generation and mining activities in this basin relative to other water management areas or basins in South Africa. But this would be this represents the 2013-2014 classification, and the idea would be to work towards achieving the 2013-2014 initial classification, and in 10, 15 or 20 years time we would have the opportunity to go through a new updated classification process where we may be able to increase the protection targets of some of these basins and try and improve our environmental performance in some of these areas. So the idea is to allocate minimum requirements on occasion, and then to achieve those minimum requirements and work towards improving our environmental performance so that we can then impose greater protection values later on. But we want to ensure that we have those features and populations and processes in place to allow us to recover from this use focus. And that again is why some of these IUAs have been allocated with a class 2, which is very important. So, resource quality objectives. What is the purpose? The purpose is to establish clear goals related to the quality of a relevant water resource that meets the class of that resource. In determining RQOs, and by the way, RQOs are synonymous with targets from a sustainable development goal perspective. So in determining RQOs or targets, a balance must be sought between the need to protect and sustain water resources and then the need to use them that represents that class. They are numerical and or descriptive statements that may relate to quantity, quality, habitat, and biota, those features of the resource as we mentioned earlier. They must take into account the user requirements and the class of the resource. These objectives are gazetted and become part of the legislation of the country, which means that they will be binding on all authorities and institutions once gazetted. The criteria for setting RQOs includes that they must be simple, easily measured, understood, and applied. In many case studies, people fear resource quality objectives because they think that it's just going to increase the amount of monitoring and management requirements that we have. But we found that by setting representative, simple RQOs, realistic RQOs, the amount of monitoring and management often decreases because you're targeting and focusing on what is important to manage and where those features occur. There need to be as few as necessary. The requisite simplicity principle is important to consider. They must use existing information where possible. They must be established at appropriate scales. Some of the RQOs are established on a site or reach scale. Some of them are established on a regional scale, for example, and there are examples of that. They must detect change. They must be comparable, repeatable, and defensible. Again, they can be established for flows, for the quantity of a resource, the quality, habitat, and biota. They must be narrative and or numeric. There may be drivers of responsible indicators, for example, for these different components. And they must finally be meaningful in terms of legislation, and in the South African case, the National Water Act. Resource quality objectives cannot be applied to an individual license, and we're going to give an example of that in a moment. They cannot replace the need for other monitoring programs. They cannot include every available indicator of resource quality, considering the requisite simplicity approach, and they cannot be considered to be absolute truths. They are objectives and or targets, which by definition requires us to work towards a particular level of use and protection, but because we generally haven't been there yet, we don't know if that balance between use and protection is adequate. So there are targets, and we work towards achieving that balance, and once we get to the point we are achieving the objective, we can then evaluate whether or not it is a suitable objective or target. That's why they are not referred to as requirements. These are not resource quality requirements. They are resource quality objectives or targets. Okay. Let's continue. In South Africa and in the publication on achieving targets for SDGs, we've proposed the 7 procedural steps. There are some modifications in different countries, but generally we look at defining those spatial areas. Step 1, establishing the vision, prioritizing selecting resource units, because we know that we need to establish these RQOs or targets in spatial scales in different places within the catchment, and that if you place one in a particular area, it generally meets the requirements of the management upstream. So prioritizing and selecting resource units is important. Then prioritizing subcomponents. And indicators includes, for example, looking at Are we going to look at quantity or quality, habitat or biota, or multiple different components, for example? We would then go through the process of drafting resource quality objectives and those limits. Just by the way, the delineation of the IUAs, the establishment of the vision, is generally done with stakeholders. They contribute directly to that because it's their resources that are being used and managed. Scientists generally then take over and look at the prioritization and selection of resource units, which is in green here, and then they take it back to stakeholders to get that validated. Then the selection of components, indicators, and change, as well as the development of draft numerical limits, is done by specialists, and then it's taken back in step 6 to the agreeing on the resource units, agreeing on the RQOs and numerical limits with stakeholders, so that there's buy-in from the beginning. Stakeholders and stakeholders on multiple levels are involved in the entire process. Finally, we go through the gazetting phase, and once it's legal, then we monitor and comply, and then after a few years we then go through the process again in an adaptive management context to ensure that we are achieving that sustainable balance between use and protection that we require. Here's a quick example just to show you how why it cannot be applied to individual licenses. An RQO, for example, can be established in a particular subcatchment to maintain a healthy population of an important indicator fish, which is the indicator of a healthy ecosystem, important indicator of the angling industry, for example. And we may find that a ammonia toxicity threshold is required by that important population, indicating that balance between the use and protection of this resource using those fish. And in this example, we may establish the threshold or the resource quality objective or the target as 4 milligrams per liter of ammonia. What's happening in this little sub-basin example is that there are these 4 industries who are all contributing to the ammonia load in the basin, and you can see that they have licenses. They would be allocated to release 2 milligrams per liter, 1 milligram per liter, 1 milligram per liter, and 2 milligrams per liter of ammonia. And we would know that the ecosystem mitigates and removes 2 milligrams itself. So you can see if you add that up, you have 6 milligrams of ammonia being released or loaded into the environment. That would be the concentration. The ecosystem itself removes 2 milligrams per liter, and at one point you would then ensure that the RQO of 4 milligrams per liter is established. So each of these users would have their own license requirements, which would then could then be integrated to achieve that 4 milligrams per liter downstream of this small water management area looking at the rivers. So how does this work? What would happen then? Well, if we have a new user come in and apply, because we have the approach of equitable utilization of resources, we would first be able to determine whether 4 milligrams per liter is a realistic limit, and in this case we propose it is a realistic limit. But now you see that there would be an excessive amount of ammonia being generated, which would then not allow this development to enter this resource. We would then propose that it be established in a different resource, that where there is allocation available for that particular industry, and or we would then go through the process of ensuring that different industries comply with their license, that we go through a cleaner production process where we require that some of the different industries reduce their ammonia load, and if it's strategic, then that industry, in combination, in discussion with the other industries, would then be allocated with a permit to release a particular amount of ammonia, in this case, which is 4 milligrams per liter. And you can see if you add it up now, you still get a total of 6 milligrams per liter. This activity, for example, I think was one of them had to require to reduce their load, and the ecosystem continues, and we would make sure that the assimilative capacity of that ecosystem is maintained, which would be the regulator's responsibility. The government would do that, and then we would still ensure that there would be 4 milligrams per liter threshold or the objective, and that it be achieved downstream of these activities. And what would we do then to ensure that it is being achieved? Well, we would monitor the fish, because the indicator for that ecosystem, that sustainable balance between the use and protection of this catchment in this example is a healthy fish community. So we would ensure that 4 milligrams per litre are met, but does this result in that healthy community of fish that we have proposed, or that population of fish that is representative of the angling community and that healthy ecosystem, does that actually occur? So we would also ensure that RQO is relevant by actually monitoring the fish themselves. And we would give the license requirements to monitor the fish and the ammonia levels to those industries to ensure that they are monitoring their environmental performance in the context of the sustainable balance between the use and protection of the environment. And it seems to be working. That is how it will work. This now is the RQO determination process, which I showed you was circular with the 7 procedural steps. Here are those 7 procedural steps. And this is just an example then of how you implement each of those steps. I just want to demonstrate how that is achieved in South Africa quickly. That the first step would be to demarcate the basin area and choose those integrated units of analysis that represent a comparable use or protection scenario. So we know that that's a high use allocation can be allocated to one area, or a protection focus can be allocated to one area, and that the size of that area, the spatial area, must be allocated. We refer to them in South Africa as integrated units of analysis. There would be multiple sites within that IUA that we can use to generate information on the state of the different resources in those areas. We would also be able, and we would unpack that into, in South Africa we refer to them as subquaternary catchments or quinary catchments, and we have data on the information. In many cases we have some information about land use activities, not necessarily the quality of the resource within each of those quinaries, but we can use different approaches to propose what the state may be like. We can look at different tools to look at the geomorphology, habitat characteristics, flow characteristics in these different areas that then make up this integrated unit of analysis. And for rivers and groundwater in particular, and in groundwater in this Olifants River case study, we only considered those shallow aquifers where there's surface water, groundwater interactions as being strategic and important, significant water resources that we considered. So this just shows on a regional IUA scale we considered the overall use and or protection attributes or requirements for rivers, and that for river connectivity and fish migrations and connectivity processes were considered on a regional scale. We considered wetlands on a regional scale, or large groundwater ecosystems. On a resource unit scale, we considered rivers and groundwater interactions. And then on an individual ecosystem scale, we also considered wetlands and dams or man-made lakes. We don't have many natural lakes in South Africa, but we do have many dams that create these artificial lakes, and we would consider them on an ecosystem scale. So you can see that multiple spatial scales and all of these considerations for all significant types of water resources that we're going to look at to help us achieve this overall balance. The next step is division, and I've discussed the classification procedure where a class is established for this whole IUA, and you can see through that process we can then propose these recommended ecological categories, and for class A they're predominantly Bs or As, for class C it's Bs and Cs with a few Ds, and for class 3 it's Cs or Ds with a few Cs, for example. So we know what the targets would be for each of these areas, and we would then, in that process, use this approach to ensure that we've aligned those recommended ecological categories for these different significant water resources to the class. Then we go through a prioritization phase and selection of resource units for RQO allocations or target allocations, and we have many tools that allow us to do that for rivers, for groundwater, wetlands and dams, and you can see that that is done with specialist workshops and specialist analyses using different tools. We have GIS shapefiles available, we have specialist information, for example, and during that process we'd then be able to establish, are we going to establish quantity, quality, habitat, or biota requirements that represent the targets that balance, as I've mentioned before, for each of these components. And that process was undertaken to then prioritize these different areas, and then we would then establish RQOs within those areas. In terms of prioritization subcomponents, selection of indicators and direction of change, at that specialist workshop we would consider quantity, quality, habitat and biota. Low flows or high flows, that you see comes from environmental flow determination studies. For quality we considered salts, nutrients, system variables and toxicants. Habitat, in-stream and riparian, we focused on those different types of habitats for water resources. Biota, fish, plants, reptiles, invertebrates, mammals, any amphibians, any organisms that were important, that can be used to represent that balance. We would then go through the process of developing the draft objectives, numerical limits, and take that back to stakeholders where we would agree on those numerical limits with stakeholders. That would be a draft gazette. We would then have a public participation meeting or meetings, and then finally the government would then finalize and gazette these objectives and then implement them by using them to allocate licenses, implement them by giving the requirements to regulators who would then unpack the requirements and look at the management of the resource and the allocation of resource use to different users. In this presentation, what I've done is I think I've gone in a little bit of detail through each of the processes, the delineation of IUAs and resource units. Okay, these are some examples. I'm going to go through it quickly. So we considered rivers, wetlands, groundwater, and lakes, as I've said, how we'd use it in different spatial scales, as I've mentioned before. And you can go through this in greater detail. In South Africa, we were fortunate to have some good information on the present ecological state and the recommended ecological categories for surface water resources, as well as many wetlands and dams or lakes across the basin. And it's very useful if you have this information, and that's why it's so important to encourage that regulators or stakeholders monitor these ecosystems. There are also other methods available to propose the probable ecological category of many of these resources in different catchments, and those tools can also be used where you're looking at risk assessments, for example, looking at the potential threat of different land use activities in relation to different habitat characteristics that you can determine from spatial data analyses, and that can help you determine these low confidence resource quality objectives. So it can still be done even if you don't have this level of detail. But we were fortunate to have present ecological condition, we had recommended ecological conditions, and you can see importantly here, prior to the determination of classes, we had an indication of what was attainable, and then through the classification process where you're trying to select class 1, 2 or 3, we use that information to select these recommended ecological categories, and you can see that we've predominantly gone for D's, C's, B's, and you can see where you have an integrated unit of analysis with the majority of resource units in a D class. That resource unit IUA would then be allocated a class. Okay, that just unpacks some of that data to show you, and we would present that to stakeholders. We would then go through a prioritization process using different tools and workshops to establish where would those areas be for rivers, groundwater, lakes, for example. We use different tools to present that to stakeholders in the context of the classes, the context of the biophysical attributes of ecosystem, the use requirements. We would be allocating our prioritizing resources in areas where downstream of activities, industries, where we had socio-ecologically important resources, for example. Those were all considered in the prioritization phase to select these resource units. This is an example for the rivers where these resource units, these sub-areas within IUAs were selected to represent each of the IUAs across the catchments that would give us those requirements which would be applicable upstream. And you can see they're generally located downstream in resource units and often below major developments, major activities. They're located on important water resources along the catchment. So you can see that is a distribution of, out of the 121, if I'm not mistaken, I think the total was 121, yes, resource units throughout the whole basin, these sub-areas. We selected 32 resource units. And this was a significant reduction in the number of sites and areas that needed to be monitored for rivers in the catchment, for example. So it can be very useful. For wetlands, you see that this was done on an ecosystem scale, and we selected 33 wetlands, and you can see the distribution of important wetlands that were selected for this basin in the study. For groundwater, we selected 31 resource units. You can see they align with surface water resources. These considered vulnerable surface groundwater ecosystems that were shallow and connected to surface water resources, and that could easily be managed by surface water regulators, because in South Africa we don't have separate management who manage groundwater separately to surface water resources, and this allowed groundwater considerations, groundwater objectives to be allocated to surface water management and where they would need to be located within this different catchment. The dams, for example, you can see these are the resource units where the 28 dams are located, but it's the dams themselves that were selected for RQO determination. We then developed, so once we prioritize, we develop the resource quality objectives, considering whether we're going to select quantity, quality, biota, or habitat as the category for the objective. To achieve that balance, we then chose measures. For example, here's an example for rivers. We wanted to ensure that sufficient water was available to meet local human needs. The measure of that objective, which is a focus objective, is discharge. We had a good estimate of how much water was required by that community to meet basic human needs. We established thresholds of potential concern, these levels where we knew if they were not being met, we would start to run out of water, for example. And then we would also propose sampling monitoring frequency for this particular objective in this process. Here's an example I'd just like to read to you for biota. The river supports a high biodiversity of biota, including those that are sensitive to water quality alterations. The measure was to sample biannually. I think this was updated slightly, but I'll get to the example in the actual Gazette. And you can see they were established for rivers, wetlands, and groundwater ecosystems. Finally, we proposed 133 groundwater objectives, 69 dam objectives, 80 wetland objectives, and 212 river objectives to represent those classes and the vision for the Olifants River catchment in South Africa. And you can see this is all the data summarized into objectives for quantity. We had 28 low flow objectives for flows, 28 high flow objectives. We had multiple quality objective requirements across the basin. And this is where it's important to highlight that from an environmental flow perspective and implementing environmental flows, it's important that we consider achieving the objectives for the resource, and whether that resource is flow or non-flow related. We need to establish those objectives to monitor and achieve the requirements of that resource. And where environmental flows are critical to that process, we must also consider non-flow variables such as water quality. Habitat drivers, for example, and where we had biota that could represent some of these, usually the integrated environmental state, we chose some biota endpoints that totaled 212 rivers, and you can see that's the balance that's put into this pie chart for the Olifants River catchment. Finally, we wrote up draft gazettes where we had regional RQOs, we had reach scale RQOs as well, and these are general requirements that we had to meet the objectives, and you can go through these in greater detail, but that just shows you what the outcomes were. And then importantly, we proposed these specific numerical limits for some of these objectives, and this is an example where in a particular resource unit the low flows were required to be maintained at a C ecological category, and the flows for low flows were proposed at different times of the year. This is base low flow requirements, and we would provide the low flow requirements in terms of discharge, that's cubic meters per second, and this would have been the 50th percentile. We would also have provided critical thresholds or critical levels that would not be surpassed. So these are 50th percentiles, for example, and these are the critical limits. We would require 100% compliance that cannot be below these requirements. And in terms of sampling methods and frequency, daily inferred to calibrated downstream gauge. The data collected from gauges downstream, in this case, would be available to monitor this requirement. And then we provide additional information to implement this RQO. And we did that for each RQO established in the Olifants River catchment. More examples of RQOs for different species. Here's an example for maintaining an indicator fish in the Volga River catchment. The indicator species was a yellowfish called Labiobulbus polylepis. We wanted to ensure that we maintain a suitable population structure and sufficient abundances to maintain the population. We had a numerical criteria representing the population structure, the ratio of young juveniles and adults. We had information, provided information for the numerical criteria. It must be obtained, and we ensured this is achieved once per year, and what type of tools would be used to measure these objectives. And that was done for water quality as well. And this is an example here of toxic levels must comply with fitness for use, which is acceptable for lifetime consumption of human users, for examples. So there can be many different types of objectives which are representative of that particular issue in that area and can be established to help contribute to that area. And as I mentioned before, although it seems like a very detailed process, we actually realized that this process allowed us to monitor and manage what was important in those areas, and the amount of monitoring required by regulators decreased significantly in this case study. We then presented the outputs in various forms, and we provided and made maps to show where the objectives were established and what the type of objectives were throughout the study area, and this is demonstrated in this map, for example, which we took to stakeholders for rivers and other catchments, wetlands, for example, and whether they were quantity or quality. And this was very useful because we had the Gazette and the outputs, and we used this as a type of index to then go and look for the particular resource unit number, to find out whether we're dealing with rivers, to go and look at the specific objective, and stakeholders then had the opportunity to go and unpack it, each one by one. And that was very useful, and it allowed us to get a lot of stakeholders involved in the process, including many informal communities who depend on the resources themselves. It was very useful. And then finally, if I can just zip through this is available for you to look at in outcomes which are available on the Department of Water Affairs' website. The majority were gazetted, and now we have some legal objectives, targets that we have available to us to implement on multiple spatial scales, and that then would achieve the classification, the vision, and ultimately allow us to achieve sustainable development goals for that catchment. And this is something that is available through these procedures in the Nile Basin. And in terms of implementing these environmental flows in the context of sustainable development goals, we propose that by implementing the environmental flow framework, a lot of this information will be generated, the ecosystem requirement information. We can then evaluate and determine user information. We can look at equitable allocation of resources throughout the basin and start to choose these targets or objectives across the basin, which would then allow us to start to balance the use and protection of our resources to ensure sustainability. And this can be achieved in the Nile Basin. And I hope that this presentation has given you an example of what's being done in other parts of the world and how this can be, what relevance this has to the Nile Basin and the environmental flow work that's been done in the Nile Basin. Finally, here's some literature for you to look at. Again, I would direct you to the background documents 1, 2, and 3 from the determination of environmental flows and environmental flow guidance by the NBI, which was published in 2016. That's available from NBI directly. I'd recommend you have a look at that. I'd also direct you to Avril Horn's group and the work that they did on water for the environment, policy and science to implementation and management. Dr. Dickens, or our publication on defining and quantifying national level targets, indicators and benchmarks. Please contact us if you want some of this material. We often have copies. And And one thing I'd also like to suggest, please, is that you look at the National Water Resource Strategy of South Africa, which I presented the front cover to you, and that is also available online. Thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge the HYDROC, the organization who carried out this work, the University of Mpumalanga, that's where I am based in South Africa. I would really encourage you to go to look at HYDROC's website and contact them if you need, as well as the Nile Basin Initiative, and if you'd like to look at our website and the type of work that we're doing. I hope that these blended learning modules contribute to the work that you are doing in the basin, and that together we can contribute towards sustainable use and protection of resources in Africa. Thank you very much.